Good evening, dear friends.
Good evening, everyone.
Knowledge is an influence, a vibration. In that sense, together with our friends, we try to elevate the vibration of our mutual field we build each week in this series. We try to concentrate on concepts, terms, words in this book, and where the being directs its concentration, its comprehension is there. And our concentration or purpose in this series is focusing our comprehension into a point and bringing out a wider understanding. You and I prepare beforehand by reading, taking notes, agreeing about some points to discuss. Still, sometimes we find ourselves in a flow of talking and giving examples that we didn't think previously. And when we finish the online streaming, we don't feel any tiredness, but rather, we feel more energized. So, we are getting nurtured by sharing this knowledge with you, dear friends. We thank you so much for your attendance, presence, and concentration. Yes, let's start reading from where we left last week. Now, let us talk, as much as necessary, about some of the mechanisms belonging to the devices of influences fluxing into matter. As we said previously, an influence's arrival at a matter means the transfer of some very subtle particles, that is, of values which have very sublime motions from the magnetic field of the influencer matter into the magnetic field of recipient matter. It occurs like this, from the magnetic field of the influencer matter, which has power and merit to respond to the need of the recipient matter, and influence departs. On the other hand, recipient matter or the being assumes an attitude, as if inviting, by extending a part of its own magnetic field, towards this influence which is intended to reach it. More correctly, it starts to send out influences which we call initiator influences. We show the wishes, desires, needs, efforts and prayers of mankind as an example of this group of initiator influences. Prayers may be reflected up above, to a certain distance. The length of these distances depends on the sincerity, rightness and degree of intensity of the wishes the prayers offer above while praying. Some prayers cannot traverse long distances, and remain below. These are weak and because of this they do not encounter beings powerful enough to realize them. And this should be so. Some prayers can reach up to very long distances. These are powerful wishes, coming from the essence and founded on true evolutionary needs. There are more possibilities for these prayers, which can reach powerful beings, to be realized. In the same way, as these initiator influences start to move, like signals transmitted from an airfield to a plane, in order to meet the first influence on its way, the first secondary influence that needs to land on this field as well starts to come out as comprehending, semi-comprehending, even sometimes automatically from its source and to advance towards the field it will land on. However, as we have said, this first influence is not unattended. Another secondary influence accompanies it from a more comprehending source, to show it the direction of the target it will reach, which we call the guiding influence. This guiding influence is sympathetic to the first influence. Nevertheless, the guiding influence is rather crude. Even if the consciousness and comprehension of the source it has come out from are superior to the first influence, it does not have the power for homing itself to the magnetic field which is expecting it. However, its attuned state for directly sympathizing with the first influence makes it possible to accompany that. If that was all, these could not reach the target anyway. There are two reasons for this. First of all, because the guiding influence does not have the scope of comprehension encompassing the all, it can deviate. That is, there are other magnetic fields with which the first influence can sympathize. Because of their needs they can also send a signal for those kinds of influences. However, this first influence should not go to these. So, because of this deficiency of the guiding influence in this regard, it is possible for it to be deceived by the signals given by the other fields and to direct the direction of the first influence to one of these. Secondly, it is possible for it to encounter a great number of interference influences that have the power to intercept the first influence advancing in its direction and to alter its disposition or its course, even to destroy it. So, the guiding influences are not in a state that can withstand these interferences, which are sometimes very strong. The first influence, when it stays unprotected against these offenses, can degenerate midway and become dysfunctional or can drift somewhere else or be dissipated. However, in the divine order, derangement of order is never allowed, such as states of impending and disrupting of an event, or of giving ill results. Because of this, impediment prevention devices are established. As for that system, besides the guiding influence that comes with the first influence, superior secondary influences come out from the sources of duty. These have a higher comprehension and accompany this consignment. We call them propulsive influences, which means dispatching influences. Propulsive influences are stronger influences, ensuring the first influence finds its way and protecting it from the offensive, random interference influences and, if necessary, destroying these disruptive influences. It is similar to this. Let us take a train, at the front of which there is a railway car and behind it, there is a locomotive. A machinist drives and controls the locomotive. Here, the railway car symbolizes the first influence, the locomotive symbolizes the guiding influence, and the machinist symbolizes the propulsive influence, albeit broadly. And signals given from the station to be reached indicate the initiator influence. In this way, when this train of influence arrives at the magnetic field of the recipient, because the duties of guiding and propulsive influences are accomplished at the threshold of that field, these accompanying influences leave the first influence at the boundary of the field and separate from it. And the first influence, through the activities it will bring out in that field, as in accordance with its purpose, affects the necessary changes upon the matter structure to which that field is subject, disrupts that matter's equilibrium, causing it to make various motions, displacing it, changing its states and forms. In short, it brings out the miscellaneous events on that matter in relation to its intensity and direction, but always by utilizing the duality principle and value. Differentiation mechanism. However, it should be remembered that all of these are always under the supervision of the sublime influences mechanism. Another long passage, but explains the working of the mechanism of influences in detail.
Here, the passage starts with knowledge about some of the mechanisms belonging to the devices of influences fluxing into matter. Any influence fluxing into matter means that the transfer of some very subtle particles, that is, of values which have very sublime motions from the magnetic field of the influencer matter into the magnetic field of recipient matter. However, we will also read in further pages, especially in parts related to the conscience, that where a human is directed to, a part of his magnetic field reaches out there and invites some values into his structure or organism. And here, we read this. As if inviting, by extending a part of its own magnetic field, towards this influence which is intended to reach it. And as examples, the wishes, desires, needs, efforts and prayers of mankind are mentioned. The book later explains the mechanism of praying. But I'd like to say something first about these general states mentioned, the wishes, desires, needs, efforts and prayers of mankind. Mechanism of these may not be in the exact way of the mechanism of prayers, because, about these incoming influences for these general states, there are many factors taken into consideration for a person hoping or wishing. These influences are filtered through some mechanisms related to destiny, etc. However, for me, one of the most important points is that, the direction we oriented with our emotions, feelings, efforts, desires etc. we send out influences or values from our magnetic field, and this acts like an invitation for the influences or values that will respond and feed our structure or organism. Yes, the mechanism is explained here with prayers as example, but in our daily life, in myriad points, we are always and constantly transmit and receive this kind of initiator influences. And, again, within this passage, the example of the prayers continue, but with this emphasis, the sincerity, rightness and degree of intensity of the wishes the prayers offer above. Yes, a human may pray in various ways, and also, may believe that he is sincere about this, but the need mentioned in this passage is actually the need of our being. Yes, we have many needs to meet in our daily life, in the worldly life, but the real needs belong to our being. So, if we pray for the needs and wishes which are more or less aligned with the needs of our being, or which are not egoistical but rather for the betterment of the situations we observe in our communal life, then, it is more possible for these influences coming out of our magnetic field to reach higher levels to invite the influences from the magnetic fields of the beings that are capable of actualizing these. And here, we learn about the mechanism of this inter-influencing. First, there is an influencer matter and a recipient matter. In a two-sided way, while a secondary influence from the influencer matter is coming toward the recipient matter, an initiator influence comes out from the magnetic field of the recipient matter. Just like a signal sent out from an airport to an approaching plane, saying you can land here. But the interesting point here, this first secondary influence can be comprehending, semi-comprehending, even sometimes automatic. And more interestingly, another influence, from a more comprehending source attends this first secondary influence, and the book names this as guiding influence. At this point, it may be good to remember the powers the beings in duty utilize for those kind processes, electromagnetic powers, mechanical powers, biological powers which are the result of many powers and cosmic powers, spatial possibilities, energies of unconfined beings which have abandoned their bodies, energies emanating from the beings at the higher realms, powers of mankind, the powers of the embodied, etc. And in our previous videos, we had already mentioned that because the original influences arriving at the unitary is too powerful for the beings in the initial steps of their development, the whole system of organizations filter and transform these powerful energies by modulating their intensity as they send these all the way down. So, there are innumerable filtration systems, intermediary plans utilized in this sense to reduce the intensity of these influences so these can be suitable for our organism.
This reminds me something, dear Ümit. In the religious culture of our country and of other countries as well, there is this practice of visiting holy places, the graves of the holy people or saints. These are kind of small pilgrimages. People go such places and pray for some wishes they have. It seems like people intuit this mechanism of prayers stated in the book, and in order to make sure that their prayers reach to the intended heights, they knowingly or unknowingly utilize the magnetic fields of these places or deceased saints or holy people with the assumption that these are stronger than their own magnetic fields. Or congregating in the mosques, churches and synagogues, again, it seems like people intuit the power of connecting their magnetic fields of the fellow believers' magnetic fields, be it instinctual, automatic, or by following the commands of their religions or belief systems. People try to strengthen the magnetic field synthesis of their congregation so their prayers can reach higher levels. But mostly, people do this within an automatic reality.
And your words reminded me a spiritual communiqué received in a session made under the control of Mr. Ruhselman from the being named as Voyager to Perfection. The being gives a prayer to the session holders, and even, after a few sessions later, asks them if they recite it. The prayer is just like this. Bestow me the power of orienting towards you without depending on any other thing. Indeed, we don't need any intermediaries or devices for this, but still, the purpose of human life is getting ready for greater communal organizations in the plan of duty, so, in this sense, we still need the power of coming together of people for true aims, the stronger synthesis of their magnetic fields, the unity. Yes, our purpose is unity. To strengthen our energy, taking support from each other's energy. Let's imagine that we are together with 10 people and an influence fluxed into your organism, and if I am there, albeit indirectly, I will benefit from this, even though, in a small dose. Let's say this brings out inner peace within you, and I will benefit from this. Because everything sends out influences in its vicinity in ratio with the influences it receives.
Yes, I'd like to underline that what I previously said was about what people do within an automatic reality. Of course, we know that within this hydrogen cosmos, this matter realm, this material body, it is not possible for us to acquire total comprehension about this spirit-being-body relation, but again, all our efforts and work is to increase the moments we are conscious, even if semi-comprehendingly, so we can lessen the grasp of automatic realities. And as we widen our comprehension, we may notice from time to time that we don't need the support of the propulsive influences for preventing interferences weakening or destroying the guiding influences, and we can send out influences to higher levels with a relative ease. And the book gives the formula for achieving this. It depends on the sincerity, rightness, and degree of intensity of the wishes the prayers offer above.
Imagine that I am praying, "Oh God, let me understand this book, the divine order and the universe," but I don't take it from the shelf, I don't read it, I don't study it. I don't spend any effort for this, but I pray. Of course, the result will not be positive. And as you said, in the further pages, there are impressive sentences on efforts and super efforts.
Yes, and if we ask how we can apply this knowledge in our daily life, it is obvious that the quality and content of our prayers must change. Personally, after reading this book, I noticed that I cannot pray as I used to do. I cannot pray by asking something anymore. For example, praying for good health. Yes, but what will be my effort in the direction of actualizing this? I mean, there are so many responsibilities involved to keep myself healthy, what to eat, when to eat, etc. Previously, I was not thinking about my part in this and just praying for it. But now, it feels like I give the responsibility over somewhere else and I don't take my own being's responsibility. So, my prayers changed. I now pray for to be conscious at every moment and to understand the knowledge of the events I encounter. Of course, we pray according to our realities. Some pray for money to buy a second condo, and most of the time, this is not the real need of that person. Yet, a parent prays for the well-being and safety of a child leaving home for a journey, and this is an example we can give for an influence sent out from the parent's magnetic field to the child's magnetic field. And those kinds of sincere prayers may be neutralizing the interfering influences, because when we get out of serious accidents without harm we say, "Must be good people's prayers protected me." And you know, in Anatolian folklore, there is a saying, "The world is protected by the prayers of good people." Well, some of our friends asking, what are these interfering influences? Well, the worldliest examples may be curses, ill wishes. And what happens when a person curses or ill think about someone? Or when thinks bad or vengeful about someone? An influence comes out of his or her magnetic field. And this activates the same mechanism, but this time corresponding with the negative influences. And we will read in the further pages about the mechanism of obsession. In such states, this interference becomes influential first and then even becomes dominant in a person's magnetic field. Here, another question from our friends, about the propulsive influences coming from the beings in duty. What are the beings powerful enough to realize prayers? Let me only say that these are beings closely connected to the beings in the plan of duty. What do you want to say about this question?
First, I'd like to add something to the topic of interferences. Now, we must remember that our body, our planet we live in, the whole universe is altogether a magnetic field synthesis, that is, all parts of it, each a magnetic field, is continuously exchange influences. Wherever there is matter, that matter has a magnetic field, and that magnetic field is always in exchange with the magnetic field that may sympathize with it. An initiator influence makes a request or inquiry, and an influencer matter sends an influence, and this secondary influence, until it arrives at the recipient matter, encounters myriad levels of influence and matter that can disrupt the value of this incoming influence by exchanging influences with it. You may remember that as the initial matter emerged, primary values were intrinsic within an atom structure. These values were ensuring the possibilities of motion in matter. So, this incoming influence has values which are intended for the recipient matter that sends the initiator influence. However, on its root, as I mentioned, there are myriad levels of influence and matter that can disrupt the value of this incoming influence, and we can consider these as interference, as well. Alright, now, as a reply to this question about the beings powerful enough to realize prayers, well, let's imagine a being that reached the initial steps or lower levels of the plan of duty. We read in this book that to the being that reached that stage, some simple duties are given. They are guiding beings for a person or a family, because their capacity of comprehension, or we can say, their power is wide enough to exchange influences and guide a person or a family. But also, there are such beings in higher levels that they can guide and govern maybe a nation, maybe the world affairs. Of course, when the scope is that wide, we cannot talk about individual beings but organizations in the plan of duty that work with this kind of duty. You may remember that we had discussed the various works of such beings when we read the passages about the organ-organizer relations.
This question made me think about the spirit seances I witnessed when my parents or elders held sometimes. You know, the intention is to communicate with a spirit, mostly of a deceased relative. And the questions that asked are mostly worldly: with whom I will marry? Will I find a job? What is the mechanism in such seances? You send out an influence and wait for a responding influence. Yet, you don't know to whom you open a door in your magnetic field. And, as you mentioned, there are myriad fields of influence, and the beings who are sympathize with our questions mostly based on earthly cravings may jump to this opportunity, and then comes many phenomena, and test and trials follow these. But what we see in the spiritual communiques given in the divine order and the universe, that Mr. Ruhselman has a sublime course of conduct by the questions he asked. He worked to reach a higher knowledge, a higher layer of influence. Mr. Ruhselman, as a session controller, led the medium to ever-ascending levels of influence, and the beings in duty at the levels he got in contact with respond this influence with their influence, hence, the knowledge given in this book. And in the beginning of this book, we read that this book was given to earth by those beings in duty to it from the unity of comprehension that we name as unitary, in a form to respond to the evolutionary needs of mankind, by a sublime plan named as the Voyagers of Destiny. I think, the high quality and the wide scope of the initiator influence, in this case, of Mr. Ruhselman, knocked a door in the higher realms, or you may say the prayer, but more correctly, a sincere effort, and the influences responding this sincere effort were equivalently high and sublime in quality and the scope of knowledge, comprehension, hence, power. Therefore, in this immense network of inter-influencing that works all the time, each being receives the influences in accordance with their comprehension, with their sincere efforts, with their level of development. And these influences are regulated and modulated by the beings in duty in every level of the higher plans. Because of this, the influences each of us receive are different in quality and scope.
When we read this passage, we can understand the outline of the mechanism of influences and their different types: a first secondary influence, initiator influence, guiding influence, propulsive influence. And in the book, this example of a train is given. To make sure the first secondary influence lands on the recipient that sends out the initiator influence without deviating or losing values, a guiding influence and a propulsive influence accompany it. And when this first influence arrives at the recipient, then the task of the guiding influence and propulsive influence finishes. So, we see here one of the established mechanisms to prevent any disruptions that may interfere with the occurrence of something destined. Every interaction is under the governance and control of the unitary. And as you mentioned, the quality and the scope of this sympathization between the first secondary influence and the initiator influence is very important. Because, we will read in the further pages that when necessary, this mechanism allows the building of a spatial setting in regard to what becomes destined in accordance with our sincere prayers or sincere efforts. For example, for a person, a different spatial setting needs to be built because of his or her developmentary needs to be, and for this to occur, this person needs to receive an influence from another embodies being, let's say another person, so they must meet or encounter. However, our guy, let's say Ümit, is so habitual that when walking, he always uses the same road, same sidewalk. And if our friends remember the passage where the details of the work an administrative group of beings are listed, there is this phrase, connecting the psychological states of mankind to certain form patterns, and building local, social forms. So, Ümit is predictable for those beings. His mood or psychological state will lead him to choose this or that road, but he needs to be somewhere else to meet that another person to receive this necessary influence for his development. So, for example, Ümit is hungry but begins craving something else than what he has at home. He gets out of the house, but the store selling the food he craves is the other side of the neighborhood. So, he leaves his habitual route and changes his direction. And when Ümit arrives at the shop, he meets the other person. The outcome depends on Ümit's developmentary needs, either this is a chance encounter, or a dispute, or love at first glance. You can think of all kinds of examples of this mechanism in all fields of life. Let's say a car hit a stray animal but didn't stop. This injured animal needs to be taken to an animal hospital because he is destined to live. So, there must be a conscientious human being arriving at the accident site, and again, that person is directed there by this mechanism.
Or, a person will take on a plane for a business trip and suddenly, he or she hears an inner voice, a gut feeling, an uneasiness that cannot be disregarded about not boarding that plane. Or misses the plane, and the direction of his whole life changes because the rest of the passengers on that flight die when the plane crashes.
Again, in the details of the work an administrative group of beings, we had read that they were utilizing the powers, that is, the magnetic field of the embodied beings, plants, animals, etc. Let's say, this plane should not fly at that hour, and by influences sent to the magnetic field synthesis of a flock of birds, the mechanism orientates them to the airport and cause a delay in departure time. And we will read more details about the working of these mechanisms at the passages about destiny, and we will see more of the greater picture.
Yes, and you mentioned this administrative plan. Maybe we need to briefly remind this passage to our friends, especially how different tasks are executed by different groups of beings. I read. If there need to be aggravating reasons in this illness, issues such as sending that man to a place with insufficient means, misdiagnosis by the doctor who will treat it, are given in full. Then, for that individual's evolutionary material in this state, if needed, several beings will work. One will prepare the organism, providing the activity of microbes in the organism. Another one will influence the mental state of the doctor in that certain moment as required. And imagine that there was no mechanism of influences like the guiding and propulsive ones, or no mechanism for filtering and regulating all influences. There may not be the world as we know it. Because, if we just consider the influences of other planets in our solar system, or the influences coming from the sun, life on Earth is protected by such preventive or protective mechanisms. Our younger friends may not remember, but in the days of radios and later first years of TV transmissions, we have a fair amount of understanding about the interference. A stronger signal from one radio station could easily obscure the relatively weaker signal from another. In this sense, if the initiator influence is strong in sincerity and scope, it can be sympathized with the higher and stronger influences that are always transmitted from the higher beings, and consequently, this means less chance for interfering influences hindering the process.
When you mentioned radio stations, again I remembered from the spiritual communiqués received by Mr. Ruhselman before his work for this book had started. In one of the sessions, perhaps due to the psychological or physiological state of the medium was in that day, or the sympathization was not strong that day, the higher plan utilized an intermediary station to regulate the flux of influences arriving at the medium, and this was named as Station C. So, this is another example for the mechanism you mentioned as preventive or protective.
Alright, let's continue reading. Influences that are received from higher places are very important. 4. Each of these influences contains sublimating values. And matter, by gradually receiving these sublime values, becomes able to sympathize with the matter and influences of the higher plan which are richer in value. And one day, by shifting to the combinations at the higher level, they start to interinfluence with them in the same plan, that is, in the higher plan. What this means is that matter ascends one level up by transiting into matter combinations at the higher level, and the development continues on like this. On the other hand, if there are more influences coming from below and influences cannot be received from above to the required degree, then things reverse. That is, because the influences coming from below are relatively simple, they are not in a state to feed all motions in the relatively more complex structure of matter. If these cannot be fed from above as well, some part of these motions begins to be erased. And that matter cannot exchange any more even with other combinations in the level it exists, and becomes mixed with the matter of one level down which can only sympathize with it, and this means the regression and erasure of its values. In that case, the ascent or descent of a matter combination, more correctly, of an organism, depend on the qualities and quantities of higher and lower influences coming to it, and this depends on power of the being who manages it, to be able to fine-tune the influences to come, to invite the necessary ones into its organism and to keep clear of the unnecessary ones. That is, these acts are under its responsibility. For example, if the organizer, the being who manages that body, cannot fine-tune the billions of influences arriving at each part of an organism, and if because of this, organizers of some parts invite influences more than necessary, then excess influences start to flux into these organs, and consequently, excess activity is seen in that group in comparison to parts in other groups. These excess activities gradually require that organ to have contradictory motions against the general order of the organism. And this situation finally causes that organ to enter a rebellious state which knows no order in the organism and which we call a cancerous organ. Therefore, the canceration event points to the need of an organ within the organism to make a much further advance in its development than it currently is. And, for excess or deficient activities in some organs in certain situations, the day comes when that organism to which these organs are subject will begin to collapse and disintegrate. If this happens in the crude internal organs of mankind, mankind talks about organic maladies or deaths. If it is seen among the particles belonging to the nervous system, they talk about psychological illnesses or cognitive disorders. All of these are the result of inability of a being to fine-tune the influences arriving at its body for certain reasons or under the influence of sublime necessities, of which the leading ones are states pertaining to the destiny of that being, that is, states which resulting from its merit and needs. Yes, in this passage we read important knowledge about the increasing cancer cases.
Yes, in the further parts of the book, this degeneration of the cells in the bodies will be revisited in the pages related to the previous world cycle. This is an introduction here for these further pages. Now, our purpose here in life is to resonate with higher and higher influences, because when we read about the destination, we understand that the journey before us contain levels of influences that have higher and higher possibilities of matter with its more and more complex states. Therefore, enrichment of our organism means adding or inviting more higher values to our organism and stay away from the lower values. And the main reason for this is each of us is a duality unit, and more positive values we add to our duality unit, the value differentiation and inescapable restoring of the equilibrium within it, will take our structure to higher levels. At this point, I'd like to remind our friends to read the previous parts of the book or watch the previous videos in this series to revisit the example the book gives about the bar magnet. Because, soon we will read more about this example, and then they can easily understand how this point of balance gets elevated as we feed our duality unit with more positive or higher values, and the conscience is the determining factor in this process. Because as we increase our capacity for conscience, the values we receive into our, let's say this pen is our duality unit or bar magnet, and let's say this gray part is positive polarity. As we invite higher values to this upper part, the side of duty, the neutral point in the middle will elevate and the lower values will diminish, that is, the earthly craving side. However, if we invite worldly values, earthly cravings, our magnetic field is fed more and more with these lower values, and it creates a deficiency in our organism or duality unit. We begin to vibrate at lower values. Yes, that's all I can say for now.
And here, we read that the importance of fine-tuning the billions of influences arriving at each part of our organism. If we cannot do this properly, some parts of our body invite influences more than necessary, and if these excess influences start to flux into these parts, then there will be excess activity in that group in comparison to other parts. And soon, these parts will be rioting against the general order of our body organism. And which is the most important influence coming to us? Of course, influences from our own being. Most of the time we receive these via dreams, or intuitions. However, when we become too involved with external world and lower values and distanced from our own being, we see the signs of disconnection in the low moods, depressions, addictions, etc. In short, whatever we do excessively diminish our connection with our being. And in such cases, these excessive influences bring out havoc in our bodies, and please remember, the being has built this body to be in service to the spirit that built the being. And if the body's imbalance reaches a point that it cannot meet the needs of the being anymore, we see these canceration cases in the cells of some organs that become addicted to these excessive and lower influences. We see here the importance of having a healthy inner world to receive higher influences by becoming more aware of our feelings, emotions, thoughts and actions, by making all of these expressions more conscientious. Even the modern medicine points to the importance of having and sustaining our mental and emotional states healthy and balanced, because these are psychosomatic indications of the cancer cases, unless there is no exposure to radioactivity or toxic chemicals. Yes, we read here, we need to receive higher values by higher influences. If we cannot invite such influences into our organism or our being cannot fine-tune this constant flux of influences, then as parts of this matter universe we cannot realize our purpose of becoming more and more complex, because only in this way, matter gets developed sufficiently to ascend one level up by transiting into matter combinations at the higher level. With the words of the book. On the other hand, if there are more influences coming from below and influences cannot be received from above to the required degree, then things reverse. Then, things degenerate, in life, in our organism.
All right, our being has developmentary needs and built this body of ours. And we, as humans, have developmentary needs to meet in the world matter, that's why we incarnated. There are billions of beings within our body and each of them have developmentary needs. And our body is the field of possibilities for those billions of beings to meet those needs. And this suitable field of possibilities is managed by our being. Imagine, if you can, the number of influences coming to and sending out from our organism for all those myriad developmentary needs. If our being cannot fine-tune all those influences, by inviting sublimating influences more than the simplifying influences, the beings of the cell groups in our organism becomes unable to meet their needs in our body. And you know, it is like, as the saying goes, getting blood out of a stone. So, it becomes harder and harder for these cell beings to find developmentary possibilities within our organism. And the part of the responsibility in this situation is ours because we are the vehicles of our being in this hydrogen cosmos. Our emotional, mental and physical attitudes, habits, addictions etc. play a role in not being able to invite sublimating values into our life. And there are also external factors like the declining quality of our foods, or the environmental factors we are exposed to. Nevertheless, all of us are in a level of comprehension that all of these make various impacts on our organism. So, we can understand which kind of influences we need to keep away and which kind of influences we need to orient in order to prevent such cancerations up to a degree. Because, as the book states at the end of this passage, such illnesses occur because of many reasons. Let me read. All of these are the result of inability of a being to fine-tune the influences arriving at its body for certain reasons or under the influence of sublime necessities, of which the leading ones are states pertaining to the destiny of that being, that is, states which resulting from its merit and needs. So, we don't know the all reasons behind cancer cases because these can be related to the being's life plan and destiny.
In some cancer cases, we see that people get a shock and by embracing life tightly, they can make drastic changes in their lifestyle. It is like, when we deviate from our life plan and purpose, a disconnection occurs and the influence exchange occurs between our organism and our being. And the shock of such a diagnosis put us back to our main path, and if we can really grasp this correlation, we can reconnect to our being, we can change our habits and addictions, we can work on our emotions, feelings and thoughts, and what happens then? Remissions or healing happen quickly, yet, sometimes, as you said, as a destiny, a person dies after a long struggle, and this is also because of the developmentary needs of that person's family members and of other persons. Especially when a child has cancer, like leukemia, and or see that the hardest test and trials are for the parents of the child, as the child goes through this illness as destined. Such cases lead arduous tests and trials for a larger community. So, in this sense, we must remember that this is not only about the being of the person but contains and encompasses all elements and components included in the system within larger plots of events. Let's check the chat box. Yes, there is a question from one of our friends. What is the relation between intuitions, premonitions, and the incoming influences?
If I understood the question correctly, it is about if to be attentive our intuitions is beneficial regarding the influences coming to our organism. Well, to be able to determine the things emerge in our mind moment by moment as intuitions, first we need to track whatever surface in our minds for a long time so we can discern which is which and ask for each. Do these things has egoistical properties? Because, we all know too well that human being has many selves and many inner voices. So, first of all, I vehemently suggest inner observation to discern the relation between incoming influences and anything emerge or rise in our minds. This is very, very important. We may easily say that this is intuition, but it is always beneficial to check if it has selfish nuances or an interference. Because, we have sensations, telepathies, we receive and perceive many things at once, but how we interpret these is the issue.
I think this ability of discernment gets developed after having many experiences. You know, sometimes we have a premonition but immediately our mind and some defense mechanisms become activated, then we doubt this premonition or intuition by saying what a nonsense, don't be a fool to think like this, and later, some events happen and we understand that our premonition was correct, we say well, I knew it. After all, we know that influences, be it from our being or external secondary influences or beings in duty, all those influences have to enter and filtered through our unconsciousness and land on our field of consciousness, and then must be expressed through our stored imagery. Soon we will read about this mechanism.
So, because of our stored emotional and mental imagery, we can twist some incoming influence that has the purpose of initiating an intuition within our mind.
Yes, our belief patterns, hardened judgments, fears etc. may twist the meaning or values an incoming influence carry. Because of this, as you said, we need to know the content of our unconsciousness, to know ourself enough to track these mental and emotional imagery to their roots. The divine order and the universe emphasizes a discerning point as it explains the mechanism of dreams that occur by the intervention of two influence sources. One of these is the influences coming from below, from surroundings, the other is the influences coming from the superconsciousness. In the first type, the images are disarrayed, but in the second type, the images in those dreams are clear and we don't forget them. Somehow their message stays with us. This is an indicator of their genuineness. So, for each of us, the mechanism of discerning intuitions is different because our mental and emotional imagery storage is different, so each of us need to discover it for oneself. I can suggest writing down such premonitions, intuitions, because when you look at your notes later, you can have a fair idea which one was an intuitive flux or not. There are many methods of doing this. Another question. Can a prayer which is not necessary for a being's development be realized?
Well, if a person prays for things which are not his or her true need, then it may become destined for that person to learn the consequences of praying for such things. I mean, let's say that person is too demanding, and at some point, these prayers are realized. Then what happens? If you remember what happens to our organism when we receive fewer sublimating values, you can easily imagine that the events that follow will be hard, mostly tests and trials to teach that person about praying for his or her true needs.
Your words reminded me the quotes frequently shared on the social media, like be careful about what you pray for. It may come true. Because such prayers may come true just to bring you tests and trials that will eventually make a person see the real lesson behind such suffering. For example, a man or woman wants to attract a certain partner and prays hard for this, but without knowing oneself and true needs. And let's say this prayer is answered and soon, that Mr. or Mrs. Right may turn out the worst nightmare that came true. So, it is obvious that we must pray for things after we really understand our true reasons and needs about the possible outcome. Still, no matter what the outcome is, what we will experience because of this outcome will teach us many things we were not previously aware of about ourselves. And please remember that each of us is a duality unit. We have a side towards the early cravings or ego and another side towards duty or conscience. We are weighed by the choices we made on which side. And even when we pray for the sublime outcomes, we still need to discern the egoistical components of such prayers. The ground of the earthly cravings gets more slippery as we advance in our development. Because, even a person that appears the most spiritual may still has cruder values which are not recognized yet. That's why we need to be more and more discerning about our inner world. Another friend asked, does each being act along the purpose of his or her incarnation?
If only each of us could be able to realize the purposes outlined in our life plans, but this is not the case.
Yes, before each incarnation, our being outlines a life plan for the next lifetime on Earth, and many beings in duty always assist our being with their influences, but still, the efforts and sometimes super efforts are needed on the part of our being in us, as vehicles of our beings in the hydrogen cosmos, to realize this life plan. And if a life plan could be realized 100% within a lifetime, I think, we would not to be incarnated 500 to 700 lifetimes to complete this stage of humanity. The most important point here is the necessity of the comparison of knowledge, because it is necessary for the widening of the being's comprehension. This accounting process is very important for the being's development. It has a plan. It has a target to reach. And at the end of the time assigned for this plan, an assessment is made, how much of this plan is realized. In which parts of this plan, I was egoistical. In which parts of this plan, I was conscientious. In which parts one become experienced. Or remained ignorant about my true needs. Did I act for the betterment of communal plan? Or remained self-centered? We know that a being advances with the conscientious choices made between the earthly cravings and duty. So, this assessment after each lifetime is not about good or bad but about the experiences gained, because the being advances in its development in either way, slowly or swiftly. One of our friends commented about merit in regard to the topic of prayers. Yes, the merit is important. From what we read so far in this book, together with you in this series, I think it is now obvious and clear that the merit, the comprehension, the conscience, the efforts go hand in hand, and as we increase one of these by our conscious and conscientious choices we make in our life, the others increase as well. And only by increasing the levels of all of these, we become able to jump or pass to a higher reality. Then it means, we are more encompassing than we used to be. And encompassment also means that this new reality we moved on also contains the previous reality, does not exclude it. This is how we advance in the true sense of the word.
Yes, let's pray that may we be able to give the times we live in its due.
All right, with these words, I wish you a good evening, dear friends.
Good evening.